all research on proteins and proteome is nonsense. That's not the goal. It's about understanding science. It's about what do we actually do when we do science, why do we do science, and how that has an ethical stake. And that is, again, the kind of aim here. I already referred to the introduction of Christine. I have another reference to her work from her recent book, where she makes a very similar point, unsurprising, right? That indeed bioethics has been too much separated from science. What has not often been questioned is the task of bioethics with regard to science. Bioethics and the science it relates to are seen as two separate endeavors. And although bioethicists thinking about research ethics have thought about how to do science ethically and not committing fraud, protecting the privacy and integrity of research participants, we have often taken for granted the starting points and the aims of science itself. And so I take up that challenge, and I hope you leave the room with a bit of a headache about I don't know what science is anymore. Right? That's more or less my ambition here. And I will do that through a kind of very classical, in a way, very boring philosophical discussion, but I hope to make it more interesting. And the discussion is precisely about that question. When do we know in science that things exist? Right, very philosophical question. Let me try to illustrate that question through a number of examples. For instance, you could also ask, do you believe that genes exist, right? A good indicator is also what do we actually mean when we speak about genes? Go to Google and see what comes up, and then you get these kind of images, and then, oh, this is a gene, right? They point to somewhere as if then it's clear what it is. Of course, you can have all kinds of questions. So is a gene just a part of DNA? But what done with multi-site genes, or the same part of the DNA doing different things? If you isolate that part of the DNA, do you have the gene, or do you also need the proteins and the function, etc.? All these complexities come up. And so do we actually know what a gene is? The kind of question at the back here is not so much to be skeptical that genes exist, but rather, what is the status of this concept in science? Is it there to refer to something in reality? Or, and that's the alternative, I'm gonna hopefully convince you a bit, is it there? Maybe it doesn't matter whether it exists, but it's there perhaps as a useful function to make sense of our experiences. And that's a bit the alternative. For instance, there have been, and this is an example of someone doubting whether genes existed in the 1930s. A French biologist, he says, well, okay, you have all these experiments by Morgan and his fruit flies, you know of them probably, which look upon genes and their localization as tangible realities. A veritable genetical mentality has been created. But these, however, he warns, have merely imaginary existence. They permit of experimentation and prognostication, and this justifies their use, but it must not be forgotten that they are only symbols. And that's the kind of the alternative. Either you say, in the world there are actually genes, or you say, no, that is just a concept, almost a mathematical formula that we use to make sense of our experience. It helps predicting the world, but don't believe that there are actually genes or proteins or whatever scientific concept you pick out. For instance, another example is, do you believe DNA exists? Again, a very tricky question, right? What do we actually mean? What part of reality are we referring to? And for instance, from a kind of epigenetic perspective, I can have the same images here. Wonder, as Barry Barnes and John Dupree, for instance, do. Well, what is DNA actually? Is that, for instance, as epigenetics likes to focus on, you have this question of methylation of DNA. But is the reality not that DNA is always methylated, right? And that this kind of abstraction that we have of DNA that then can be methylated is actually a kind of fiction that only exists in the lab, right? We created that purified DNA in the lab and we study that fiction and we base a lot of knowledge on it. Again, the goal is not, if you say in that sense DNA is a fiction, that doesn't conclude that we should get rid of that concept. It says it's a very useful concept, but it's a symbol by which we try to make sense of experience. And that's a bit of the debate. This is a recent example, more closer to proteomics I came across. G protein coupled receptors, do they exist? There was a nice paper I found about that as well. for those who would want to read more about what it actually means to have these kind of discussions. The authors really describe the history of the debate of, does this really exist? Is this, again, that's another quote from the 70s, is this just a nice abstract concept conceived to explain observed responses without being real? And when do we accept it to be real? Final example, mesosomes. Why do I pick? Do you know what mesosomes are? Mesosomes were a bit let me put the story in the following way. In the 1960s, a number of observations showed a new organelle in cells, and they called it mesosomes. And there were numerous publications on what the function would be and how does it work. And eventually it ended up to be just an artifact by the preparation methods, right? So it doesn't really exist, but nonetheless, there were numerous publications on it. It's under certain conditions, you have that formation in the cell, but it's not an organelle that is standardly there in every cell. Again, it has this question, does it exist? Well, in a certain sense, like the purified DNA, yes, under certain laboratory conditions, it exists, but not as a kind of independent reality out there. Again, that is a case discussed by Marcel Weber in a book, Philosophy of Experimental Biology. And there is quite remarkably given, so that it was unmasked as an artifact is quite remarkable given the fact that from the 1960s until the mid-1980s, they were actively studied in many microbiological and biochemical laboratories around the world. Several hundred articles were published in the scientific literature reporting on the structure and possible functions of mesosomes. So how is it possible that some entity that had been the subject of so much research all of a sudden ceased to exist? The debate in that sense, and you'll get that debate if you ever followed or have followed a course in philosophy of science, you get this debate. It's about the status of theoretically postulated concepts. In science, you introduce concepts that do not exist in daily life, and you claim, or some would claim, and that's a debate, that they actually exist. When can we assume that? Should we assume that or not? Do proteins exist? Do dark matter exist? Does gravity exist? Again, if you deny that, you don't say that there is no gravity or something, but you say that gravity is a useful fiction to capture the experience of falling and whatever. It's kind of a distinction between either you say science commits us or allows us to believe that these concepts actually exist, that there are proteins, that there are genes, that there is DNA, or, and that's the alternative positions, you say, no, science just commits you to accept these concepts as useful. You don't have to believe that they're real. That doesn't matter. You can do that in your private life. That's up to you. In science, it's only about accepting them to get to the right predictions, the right way of making sense of reality, of your experiences. Hence, the positions typically are called realism. If you say science is really about showing us the reality out there, or you say empiricism. It's about experienced, the empirical side. Slightly different put, and that's where I want to go to. I don't want to delve too deep into that debate. I want to ask basically, why should you care about that debate? And I would say you should care about the debate because the actual question behind that question is, what is actually the goal of science? Why do we do science? And they have different answers to that. Again, framed under one concept, you could say realism is about, science is about explanation. That's a concept you will use day in and day out. Hopefully at the end of the day, again, you will be a bit skeptical of your own use of that notion. Explanation means precisely that. Science is about, we see all kinds of experiences, things happening to us, and we want to explain the underlying hidden factors that actually produce this. So we want to go beyond experience, find what actually is causing that experience. Again, the empiricist says no, it's just about empirical adequacy. It is about, we have all these experiences, all these predictions, and whatever at the end of the day allows us to predict, to control, to link all these experiences that we have in the most economical, beautiful fashion, whatnot, That's all that science can do. You can never jump beyond experience. Or what is typically also linked with this is different kind of questions that are the scientific questions. The realist would say science is about why questions. We want to know why things happen. What is the underlying cause? What is hidden behind it? Whereas the empiricist says, no, actually, why questions are not scientific questions. You can never really answer a why question through science. Science answers how questions. How does it work? How does one thing result in something else? Right? That's what science maps according to empiricism. It's about relating all the experiences, all the predictions, etc. that we have. So again, I'm not going to delve too deeply in the arguments. I want to precisely go beyond and ask the question, why should we care about this debate? And maybe care about, as I assume most of you have realist intuitions, why should you want to be an empiricist? Why should you be difficult, except if you're a philosopher? And the arguments, typically, I just want to give you a kind of flavor of the argumentation. I think the empiricist, the strongest argument is very simple, namely it is experience all the way down. In the sense of course, we base science on empirical facts, on experience. Yes, we can be wrong about our experience, but how do we know that? By other experiences. That's all we get. There's nothing beyond the experience that we ever face. It's always experiences correcting experiences. That's what science is about. All the rest is metaphysics, theology, and whatnot. The realist, again, against that would say, well, there must be a reason why all these experiences or why our concepts describing these experiences work, namely because they are true, because it works, because it's real. If we talk about ourselves in terms of DNA, and that helps us to understand ourselves, of course, there must be something out there, namely DNA, that actually allows this. And so otherwise, it would be miraculous that all our experiences can be captured by our concepts, by made-up concepts, by fictions. And typically, they also point to a kind of manipulability argument. If all our concepts are fictions, how come that I can make proteins in the lab and let them do things? I can manipulate proteins. They're not just in the head. They're not just fictions. Possible response from the empiricist would be what is in philosophy called the pessimistic meta-induction in one form. Namely, if you look to the history of science, it's full of very successful theories in predicting, in controlling phenomena that are completely wrong. Right? So prediction, even manipulability, doesn't mean that you're actually aiming for the right thing, that you have really grasped reality. They can radically change. Think again of the history of biology. Sure, genes, DNA, etc., could capture so much of our cells, of our lives, etc. But nowadays, with the post-genomics, there are a lot of skeptical questions to ask whether gene, DNA, etc., are actually useful concepts, what to do with them, how to rethink them. Anyhow, and so those are the kind of argumentations, and there are numerous books, papers. That's why it's boring, because there's so much on this debate, but I'm not delving into that. What I want to delve into is precisely why should we care about that debate, and why would you ever want to have this debate? And maybe one reason to already appeal you a bit of why an empiricist position might be worth considering is the history of the debate. Namely, there is an argument to say that this kind of empiricist position was very prominent in the past in the form of positivism, instrumentalism, conventionalism, many terms, and many famous scientists and philosophers endorsed this position. So especially in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And again, a point to stress there is that most of these figures were actually deeply engaged with science. They were the most scientific-minded persons of them. And so you're not an empiricist if you want to go against science. it seems almost the opposite. If you're really, really involved in science, you should be an empiricist. That seems the case if you look at these figures. Auguste Comte is the father of positivism. Ernst Mach, the scientist you might know about, also Mach. And Pierre Duhem was also a physicist, historian of physics. Now, in recent scholarship, precisely that history of empiricism or history of positivism has been re-explored. And I think the main conclusion of that, and that's part of the answer that I want to focus on today, is that the reason why you want to be an empiricist or a positivist is or was typically a very political matter. It was not just an abstract debate about the nature of science. It was also a political question of how to organize society, and especially what is the place of science in society? What do we actually want from society, from science in society? That was this at stake in that debate. And I want to illustrate that a bit through what I would say two empiricist philosophies or philosophers, Auguste Comte and the recently deceased Bruno Latour, who I consider also very much an empiricist philosopher. So two examples of what is the underlying motivation and how that leads to, again, philosophy of science equals ethics. Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte is a bit about the following question. And so again, that question, what is science about? According to this empiricist stake, very important, it is not about having a certain worldview, believing that the world is only material, or believing that natural selection is true, etc. All these kind of beliefs, that doesn't matter, that doesn't equal science, and those can be wrong. Science is rather about, again, the use and the training of the use of experience to correct our knowledge. That's the beauty of science, right? That you are capable to correct your beliefs, to correct the theories, the concepts, etc. that we use, again, through experience. And so, in that sense, as science should be about fostering that capacity to revise our concepts, to create an atmosphere, a context where any kind of concept, how basic and how simple it looks, can be thrown out, revised, and something else put in its place. And so if genes don't work, no matter, I never believed they were real anyway, I can use something else. And that freedom that you have in empiricism. Auguste Comte is very famous for his three-stage model of history and of science. And so he always read history, so this is in the 19th century that we are speaking, going through three stages. At first, you want to make sense of something, you don't have a theoretical apparatus, so you draw from religion, he would say. Then religion is typically replaced by metaphysical concepts, and so you explain phenomena not in terms of God anymore, but in abstract concepts like matter or gravity, or something like that, or life force and biology, kind of vitalism. And then he says, we even go beyond that in a positive stage when we give up that futile desire to look for underlying causes. Well, stop asking the why questions, what are the underlying principles, and just realize that science is not there to find the ultimate truth about reality. And that was the theological dream. Science is there to improve society practically by predictions, by helping us. And so the kind of conclusion is, realism actually is just theology in disguise. If you're a realist, you're just continuing this belief that you can go beyond this empirical world to a higher reality. Examples, in the typical example they would use is physics. And you could say Aristotle thought about the world and life, etc., in very anthropomorphic terms. And then that was replaced by Newton, very abstract principle, gravity, etc. But still you could say, well, what does Einstein add to Newton? The mistake of Newton was he still was a realist, for instance, about space. He thought there was something like absolute space. And what allows progress in the case of Einstein is get rid of this kind of realist concept in science. The more concepts that you thought were part of reality that you throw out, the more progress science makes. And that's the dream of positivism and the dream of empiricism for Auguste Comte. And biology, you could say something very similar. We used to think about life in terms of vital forces. Then, of course, you have molecular biology, etc., more mechanical worldview. But still, you could also wonder there, thinking about the cell as a machine or the cell as a computer, etc. It's very risky to fall into that realist illusion of thinking that you actually capture the reality. Because typically, these metaphors are metaphors, fictions. They help you to make sense of the world, but you should go beyond that. For instance, you could start thinking about the cells in terms of processes and something else. And again, if you take an empiricist stand, you have that freedom to not be attached to all these concepts as if they are about reality. The only thing that matters is experience. If experience needs different concepts, too bad for the concepts. So that's Auguste Comte. And science should be about that capacity to revise, and we should foster that. We would say that's a very negative way to characterize science. Science is about destruction, almost, of metaphysics, of theology, of realist dreams. That's why the other figure is there, the happy Bruno Latour, who has a positive message in all the senses. So Bruno Latour, very similar message, again, empiricist, but he would slightly phrase it differently. Science, again, is not about having a certain worldview, it's about using experience, but in what sense? Well, science is about learning to precisely be affected in new ways by the world. That's the beauty of science. That's why we introduce instruments, concepts, etc. Not because they capture reality, but because they allow us to make new distinctions. Things that we do not see without the instrument, things we cannot take apart without the concepts that we use. That's the function of these concepts. Or differently formulated, science is about learning to be affected by hitherto unregisterable differences. Or even more normatively, good science is about providing occasions to differ, meaning a good scientific experiment creates room for the world to say, this is not the same as this. And to make distinctions within your experience, to become more subtle in your experience, and to extend your body to be affected in more ways. That's the kind of metaphor. Or a kind of very Latourian metaphor would be, good science is like wine tasting, right? That is, as a novice, every wine tastes the same, but what do you learn throughout the process to make distinctions between the different types of wine? And that's what good science also does. It doesn't aim to capture the ultimate wine or something like that. It makes no sense. But it allows you at the end of the road to make more subtle distinctions and do something with these distinctions. So what is the problem of an empiricist with realism? Let me summarize that a bit and add another reason. I think the two main reasons we saw so far was, one is that being a realist leads to kind of metaphysics, to speculate beyond science. If you're a realist, you always think you have captured reality as it really is. And you jump over experience a bit. You think, genes, that's actually what the world is really about. I can calm down now, my work is done in a way, right? According to the empiricist, at least. The second, slightly different reason, is more from Latour, could say, the danger with realism is, again, that it distracts you from the actual experience. And you always are a bit, how to put it, you're always a bit too eager to jump over the actual things you experience to go beyond what's beyond it. Right? You always want to capture the ultimate particles, parts of the world, and not those experiences. Those are very instrumental to the explanation, right? But whereas for the empiricist, it's all about the experiences. The ultimate goal is, in that sense, empirical adequacy. You have to account for all of experiences. There is no goal beyond that. Now, why would you care about this? Why would you take that position? How does that lead to a more political or ethical aspect? That's that kind of third element. Again, I think most empiricists would say if you take a realist position, you risk again being very conservative in science. We already know that the world exists of genes and DNA, etc. You don't want to change that. But also in society. Again, the project of positivism, etc. was we need to rethink the position of science in society. What do I mean by that? Again, it has to do with not a very beautiful philosophical question. Namely, what is the basis of our knowledge? What is the ultimate basis? If you ever annoyingly keep asking, but how do you know that? How do you know that? Where do you end up? The classical answers there, again, would be some kind of ultimate metaphysical truth, self-evident truth, whatever. I don't think many of you are convinced that those exist. You would say that's a kind of dogmatism. What is then the obvious alternative answer? You would say, well, maybe empirical data, empirical facts, or knowledge is ultimately based on empirical facts. Of course, an empiricist would say that, right? Wrong. That's not what an empiricist would say. Because precisely, he would say empirical data without a framework doesn't make any sense, right? You can look through the microscope, see all kinds of funny stuff happening, but if you have no clue about any kind of concepts to make sense of what's happening there, nothing is going to happen. So you have kind of problem there. So what does the empiricist then add? And that's another concept that I want to introduce, is the ultimate basis actually of our knowledge might be conventions. That ultimately, the ultimate choices that we make to start making sense of the world are based not on a kind of foundation, but on a choice by us. About what happens if we start looking to the world from this perspective, right? That is conventionalism, and that was a term I mentioned earlier as an alternative to empiricism. Conventionalism means thus that science ultimately is based on a number of assumptions that themselves have no scientific grounding, but are based on pragmatic criteria. And by that I mean, again, it depends on, and that's how we get to the ethics here, depends on what you actually want from science. If we want prediction, that if it helps us predicting the world better, etc., that's a kind of pragmatic criteria that we can use. But we have to have that debate. And that's, I think, why an empiricist take precisely forces you to reflect on science fundamentally on an ethical level. Because ultimately, you want to make sense of the world, you always have to ask, but why do I want to make sense of the world? What is my purpose of investigating these aspects of the world? Whereas, let me already mention that, whereas in the case of the realist, the reason seems simple. I just want to understand reality as it really is. No questions asked, no further investigation. The empiricist, in a sense, is unsure what the answer is. That's precisely what we as a society should have as a discussion. What do we actually want from science? We cannot hide behind this kind of ultimate dream of the ultimate truth and everything, the progress and the best society, etc., will follow from that. Again, that's very theological, metaphysical thinking for the empiricist. Now, so conventions. You might again think this might be a dangerous thought. Is this not, then can we pick any conventions what we like? Can we create any kind of science that we like? A note on that, and that's basically has been stressed more since the 1980s. What do we mean by conventions here? Well, the idea is indeed that our most precious concepts, genes, the proteome even, are perhaps fictions. The empiricist would follow up on that, and we shouldn't care. That doesn't matter. That doesn't say it's wrong or it's useless. That's not the criteria. Criteria is, can they help us make sense of our experiences? But the second point is, of course, these fictions are not just in our head. We actually think of the example of DNA, mesosomes, and whatever. We create them materially in the lab. we reorganize the world to make it predictable. That's what an empiricist would say. Of course, we cannot do everything with it, but we negotiate with the world through our experiences to allow it to be predictable. And that's what you again do in a lab by doing all that work to keep it clean, to keep it sterile, to keep it isolated, etc. That's reorganizing the world so you can create these fictions that will actually indeed help us to understand experiences, to predict, and whatever other purpose you have of science. So in that sense, why be an empiricist? Because it's in a way a very emancipatory project, you could say. You could call it emancipatory conventionalism. In a sense, that was again why many of these scientists, these society reformers, which want to base society on science, were intrigued by empiricism because precisely you cannot use reality as an excuse anymore. And that you ultimately say, yeah, but we just study the reality as it is, and if it's bad for us, yeah, too bad. No, here, from an empiricist point of view, you always have to take responsibility for what do you want to do with science, and how, what kind of conventions do you use, etc. Again, the goals of science are up for debate. They do not follow naturally out of reality or something like that. And so we should have that debate on what do we actually want from science. Is it truth, or is it prediction? Is it control, or is it health? Is that the ultimate goal that we want from it? There can be multiple goals, they can conflict. We have to have precisely debates on that. If I haven't provoked enough already, I would say even get rid of that notion of truth. We don't need truth at all as a concept in science. Science does not aim for truth. It aims for, again, empirical adequacy. That's enough. Of course, you have to take the facts into account. You don't have to take truth into account, whatever that is. And it doesn't add anything except metaphysics, theology, etc. And to end, let me try to illustrate a bit what you can do with that kind of empiricist point of view. That's precisely the kind of call to all of you we need, and you always should talk about purposes. Why are you doing the research? What are you actually trying to achieve, and why? For instance, take one example. How does it conflict with another value? Privacy, for instance. We have discussed it already a number of times today, the GDPR. And if you look at what is in the GDPR, it's all about purposes. Personal data must be collected for purposes that are specified and explicit. Or personal data processing must be adequate and limited to what is necessary in relation to the intended purpose. Or same with storage, of course, storage of personal data only for as long as it is necessary with regard to the specific purpose. And so you should, and you are, of course, always thinking about what is the purpose of this research, etc. And the empiricist would say, try to avoid using reality as an excuse in the sense of just saying, I don't know what my purpose is, I just study reality as it really is. That's not taking up responsibility in a way. Second example is about health. Again, there you have a conflict. If you, we are in medicine, most of us here. If you're studying health of individuals, etc., how do you align that with studying reality as it really is, or truth, or whatever other purpose you have? I'm inspired here more by Georges Canguilhem, for instance. In his work, for instance, he stresses that kind of tension that can exist between the individual experience of a patient and whatever the physician or medicine says, right? There's a kind of conflict. Or slightly different put, what if you have a certain new drug that might work or might not work? You don't know, you haven't done the test yet, but it can maybe for that individual already help, or does help, or he wants it, etc. A real case of that was, of course, the history of AIDS. You had very much experimental drugs there. Of course, they were not approved yet, they were experimental, etc. And then you have to make that choice. Do we wait for the proper science and truth to happen, or do we already give them to these individuals and they might save their lives or not? Right? So you have that tension between what are we doing the science for? Is it to save these individuals, or to really find out what AIDS is, etc., or what helps? etc. And the point is, again, these kind of conflicts happen all the time in science, and we should bring them to the surface. Again, doing science is always taking a stance in these debates. So, to conclude, should we care that the proteome exists? In a way, there are two possible suggestions, I think, in my presentation. At least the one would be, we should not care, and rather focus on the goals of why we use that concept of proteome, whether it exists or not. Right? Why are we actually talking about proteomics here? But there is also a slightly different conclusion, and that's a different idea of care here. Well, we could of course, yes, you could say we should care about that fiction. You have probably helped create that convention of let's talk about ourselves in terms of the proteome, etc. You might have good reasons for that. You might perceive me as attacking those reasons, and thus you should care in that sense of trying to defend why it is actually useful. I'm not denying that, by the way. But if you say we should indeed care for its existence, that means something else here. That means you should defend it, you should nurture it, and especially also take responsibility for it, for its effects. How does it affect the self-perception of individuals? What if it leads to medicine that's actually harmful for individuals, etc.? You cannot again hide that I was just doing research. No, you engaged yourself for that project of the proteome. And you should be willing in that sense and be capable and knowledgeable about what it means to take responsibility for the proteome. All right, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you.